And let me start on this note. When the 2021-2022 season started, well, there were those who felt that the French had robbed the Spanish, and there was a funeral atmosphere around La Liga because three of the biggest names in the league were lost. Zinedine Zidane, coach of Real Madrid, was leaving Real Madrid. And then you had Sergio Ramos, who was going to PSG. And then most famously, we had Messi, who had been involved in a messy attempt to renew his contract, who was heading to PSG in tears. And there were those who began to wonder how the La Liga season was going to be like and whether there was going to be anything joyous about the season. As it turns out, perhaps Semra will be the best to give me the responses on that. Semra, the news of the demise of La Liga at the beginning of the season, was it grossly exaggerated on hindsight?
Oh, without a doubt. It was definitely grossly exaggerated. I mean, there have been superstars coming and going throughout the history of La Liga Santander. Obviously, I think there was a bit of a concern because you had two really big names leaving at the same time. But at the end of the day, life goes on. And people very quickly forgot about Messi and Sergio Ramos in Spain because it was a very exciting competition. And there was competition all the way throughout the division. And everybody was trying to see how Barcelona were going to cope without Messi. Everyone wanted to see what was going to happen with Real Madrid, but they made some very astute signings to really fill in at the back, previously with Militao and then David Alaba coming in. The two of them, after a rocky start in general with the back four, because there were plenty of issues with injuries, but once they settled in, it was almost like you forgot that Sergio Ramos and Varane even left. So the thing is, La Liga is a very rich league whenever it comes to the talents, the scope and the breadth of talents. And it's always a really intriguing and fascinating league to watch. So, you know, short-term memory, I guess you could say, when it comes to fan. And after the initial blow of everybody leaving and the surprise factor of it, and once the competition started, it really was very exciting to watch indeed.
Samara, I'll come back to you in just a moment because it seems what Messi said is true. Because during Messi's press conference, when he arrived at PSG, he said what matters is the teams. And he said Barcelona and Real Madrid. And there's also Madrid, Sevilla, Valencia, and Atletico. So I'll be coming back to you as to how these teams actually stepped up in what was an incredible roller coaster of a season. But let me just switch to Jeremy because La Liga's loss was Ligue 1's benefit with the arrival of these key players. Did it really shape out the way it was supposed to be, Jeremy?
Not exactly, I don't think. I mean, Sergio Ramos, I think even when he was signed, the people sort of were torn. Some people thought, you know, it's obviously a great name and maybe a good coup for him to come in for free at PSG. But I think there are a lot of people who were aware that his best years were past him, and certainly his physical peak was past him. And I think what we saw during the year sort of bore that out. I think it was only 6 or 7 starts throughout the season, and not necessarily his fault because of physical problems, but he certainly has been, I think it's fair to say, a flop. And then Messi, it's really difficult to judge how his season's gone. I mean, he hit the woodwork, I think, 10, 11 times during the season, which is a sort of record in Europe this year. But he did come up with, I think it was 13 assists. So he certainly played his part in PSG's sort of winning back the title, but he was hugely overshadowed by Mpabbe, of course, and obviously PSG are only really judged by how they do in the Champions League. And although he had a couple of good performances, there was that fantastic goal against Manchester City, and we certainly saw signs in the Champions League and at the end of the season that he and Mpabbe are really developing an understanding, so that could be interesting next year. But I think overall he didn't quite hit the heights that we'd hoped for. I hesitate there because I was going to hoped for. I mean, if he had scored 40 goals this season, as he often has done in the past, then I think a lot of people would have just carried on with their idea that Liga is a farmers' league and that it's embarrassing how PSG are walking all over it. So in some ways, it's a positive for Liga that Messi did have his issues in some ways, but I think we've also got to appreciate that, again, he's probably past his peak, and having spent his whole career and since he was a kid basically at Barcelona, he's still a human being, and he needs to adapt to a new footballing culture, but also a new country, a new language, and a new culture in general. And he's shown that it's not that easy. And sometimes I think maybe we expect a little bit too much from footballers in that sense.
Let me go back to Semra. Semra, which stories caught your attention the most in this La Liga season? Of course, Real Madrid winning, Ancelotti parachuting in very quietly to engineer that victory. Barca looking dead at some point in ninth position and turning it around. But you tell us, what were your top stories, the most remarkable stories within this season for La Liga?
Oh, I mean, there's so many to choose from. I'll try to keep it short. Obviously, I think the number one story has to be Real Madrid, has to be the return of Ancelotti, especially when last summer Zidane decided to leave and there were those departures and everyone thought this would be a year of transition for them. And remember, Ancelotti was fourth or fifth in the list whenever Florentino Perez was looking for a replacement for him, which seemed kind of crazy considering he was the one that led them to La Décima in 2014 when he took over, and they won an historic 4 trophies in a single season. That had never happened before for Real Madrid. So it turned out to be a lot better than everybody expected, that's for sure. And the fact that they went on to win their 14th European Cup was really very impressive in the way they did so as comeback kings and knocking out all of the favourites along the way in some really tough competition, and no one thought they could do it. So for me, that takes the cake, you could say. Obviously, Barcelona with Xavi coming in, I think it was around November, December, something like that. And as you rightly say, they were ninth. And it was just all about trying to get into the top 4, trying to get into the Champions League. The fact that they had some really savvy signings in the winter transfer market in January brought exactly what they really needed. He was able to build a team that was competitive, that showed relentlessness, that really showed a lot of hunger and desire, and looked much more similar to what you would expect from Barcelona. Obviously, very much still a work in progress, a long way to go. But the fact they got into second and finished there really was remarkable in and of itself. You use the word engineer. I want to borrow that for a moment because Manuel Pellegrini, the manager of Real Betis, famously known as the engineer, he was brilliant with them. And for me, they were one of the most exciting, most fun teams to watch throughout the entire season. And I really had hope for them. They would make it into the Champions League for the first time after 15 years, but not too shabby. They ended up with silverware for the first time after 17 years. They really put a lot of pressure on those ahead of them. They came so close to finishing above Sevilla, who did have a bit of a disappointing season. The same with Atletico Madrid. But for me, they're absolutely one of the standouts and worth a special mention for what Real Betis have done. And now they'll be in the Europa League next season. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they're capable of.
Speaking of the European qualifications and participation, 2 things come to mind. There's the remarkable run of Villarreal in Europe and the fact that they almost missed Europe. And it would have been almost unthinkable, for their coach, given how often he's in Europe. And then there's a story of Real Sociedad, who at a point were top of La Liga and seemed to have faded badly as the season went on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Villarreal is another stellar story. You're absolutely right. I mean, what they did in Europe this season was just incredible and historic, that's for sure. The fact that they knocked out Bayern Munich, Juventus, they almost eliminated Liverpool to make it to the final. They were about 45 minutes away. It would have been spectacular to see an all-Spanish final. Didn't happen that way, but still so much credit to what they did. And Unai Emery is obsessed with tactics. He really studied his opponents in so much detail. He had a game plan from A to Z. He always had a solution for any problem that came up throughout a game. And I think so many people underestimated them that in some ways it gave them a little bit of a superpower. So for what they did in Europe, and remember the year before, they actually won the Europa League and they went to the final undefeated and then beat Manchester United. So they've taken down some really big names along the way. And they're a very small team from a town of 50,000. So it's amazing how well they've punched above their weight. It is very sad to see that, unfortunately, they won't be in the Champions League or the Europa League next season. But you're right, they very narrowly held on to a place in Europe. They're going to the Conference League, but because they gave so much attention to continental competition, it meant that their league form really left a lot to be desired. And plus, they were just very tired and worn out physically and mentally. Real Sociedad, their main problem this season was that they didn't have people to really put to bed the chances they created. They created loads of opportunities in front of goal. That wasn't the issue. Defensively, they were very sound. They hardly conceded at home this season. They were very, very good there. They did lose some points on the road, but the main issue for them was that nobody was scoring. And so that's something they'll have to work on this summer, especially if they want to go farther than they did last season in Europe.
Just one last comment on the league season as it went. And, again, just two last stories for me. Let's go to the other end of the table, which is the bottom. At some point, it looked like Granada were going to escape and it was going to... Just tell us about that miraculous survival by Mallorca in the end to stay in. And I understand that, they have stayed in. And then tell me about the outcome of the playoffs and which people are coming up.
It was a bit crazy the last day of the season. Going into it, Cádiz and Mallorca had the most difficult chances of staying up. Granada, of the three, were in the best position. They were in the highest part of the table outside of the bottom three. And they had a game at home. They were the only ones of the three that played at home. They were playing against Espanyol, who were mid-table, had their homework done, weren't really playing for anything. They just sacked their manager. They didn't have their star goal scorer. So, I mean, everything was there for Granada to win this game, and they didn't. And then you have Mallorca and Cádiz, who had extremely difficult games on the road, and we didn't really think they would be able to get anything from those games, but both of them ended up winning. So it was quite spectacular what happened, and it just once again shows that sometimes football can completely defy logic. And it was a really exciting and thrilling final day. Obviously, it was very disappointing for Granada, who would be relegated, unfortunately. But the good news is they have a very solid project behind them. And I suspect they'll do a really good job in rebuilding the team if they need to over the summer to try and get them to come straight back up next season. So far, we only know two teams coming up. It's Almería and Valladolid. The playoffs are in the middle of the rounds right now. There's still a final to go. And it looks like it's going to be Girona and I forget who else it is. Tenerife, that's who it is. Girona and Tenerife. So there you go. Still one more slot to be decided.
Well, I understand Ronaldo started that bicycle run from Valladolid to Compostela after Valladolid managed to come up and qualify. We look forward to seeing them play in the season. Let me just talk to you guys finally about this Mpabbe saga that has characterized the end of the season. And let me come to you first, Jeremy. Over whether or not Mpabbe was going to go to Spain or settle in France. Was this a battle for the soul of the two leagues? LaLiga feeling that this was going to be a major boost to them, and France feeling that Liga had to hold on to their prized asset?
I think for all the reasons that Semra mentioned earlier, I'm not sure that it was crucial to La Liga that Mpabbe came in, but certainly having lost Ronaldo and Messi, it would have been a great statement for them if Mpabbe had joined Real Madrid and they could have boasted the person who I personally think is the best footballer in the world at the moment in their league. But I think that La Liga is robust enough that they can survive without him. What I think might be difficult is that Real Madrid clearly have based their transfer policy over possibly the last year or two on the basis that he'll come in, and him changing his mind this late in the day affects them. For example, they didn't bid for Haaland on the basis that Mpabbe would come in. So it will be interesting to see how they react to that. For France and Liga, I think it's difficult to talk about the whole league because obviously PSG is so different to the other 19 clubs in the division. But I think to retain Mpabbe in Liga, to still have him, gracing the other grounds during the season, to still be able to talk about him as a French player playing in the French league, I think is a huge thing. I'm not convinced that the sort of people in charge at PSG cared that much about Liga and about what it means to France so much as what it means to PSG. I think the fact that, for example, the president Emmanuel Macron was regularly phoning Mpabbe to kind of persuade him that it's important he stays shows that it is important to France. And I think with this deal, I think Mpabbe sort of takes on a new dimension that no footballer has had before. I mean, he's effectively we've had player coaches, player managers. He's almost a player chief executive now. It seems like any footballing decision, coaching appointment, transfer decision is going to be run past Mpabbe first. And that puts a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. But it shows, I think, the value of certainly what he means to French people, and hopefully what France means to him as well. But I still wouldn't be surprised if in a year or two he moves to Spain anyway. It just depends whether he's burnt his bridges with Real Madrid now.
Semra, if it wasn't such a big deal to La Liga, why was there such outreach by the people who run the league?
To be honest, it's a good question. And I think it had more to do with the financial situation of PSG than Mpabbe himself and his decision not to come to Spain, because I completely agree. I think in a year or two, it's very possible we see that Kylian Mpabbe coming to Real Madrid anyway. But I think it's more about the fact that La Liga feel and Real Madrid feel that they can't compete with clubs such as PSG or Manchester City that have these bottomless pockets and just have all sorts of resources when it comes to finances. And so for them, they felt that it was very much a slap to the face of football. And so they felt as though they needed to say something to fight against it, to basically say we need to have some kind of limitations here because nobody will be able to compete with clubs like this who just have bottomless resources. So I think it was just an excuse for them to kind of take a jab in a larger sense, in a larger picture here, than actually focus on Mpabbe himself. But I'm not really sure what the response will be to this ultimately, if I'm honest with you. But La Liga is certainly trying to find ways to help clubs secure finances, because it's been a very difficult couple of years with COVID, especially having a really big, taking a really big toll on a lot of clubs, as it has for many, many clubs all across Europe. This is not something just specific to Spain, obviously. So again, I think it'll be interesting to see what the ultimate reaction is to it, or response is to it going forward. But it was more about that than anything else.
Finally, guys, and looking forward, Jeremy, from your end in France, is it going to be another summer where French teams lose players to the English Premier League, to La Liga, and PSG just builds to try to win the Champions League? Or do you reckon that something special or different will be happening in La Liga this summer?
I think it's going to be more of the same. You know, apart from PSG, every team in France is effectively a selling league. You know, the day after the season ended, Boubacar Kamara announced that he was going to Aston Villa, who, you know, aren't even one of the top teams in England. Tchouameni is likely to go to Real Madrid, although Liverpool have also been linked. I'm sure Lyon will have to fight off bids for a couple of players as well. I think it's going to be, the same as ever. And the frustrating thing is that, you know, even in an individual season, like when Monaco won the league in 2017 or Lille last year, you know, PSG can be got at in one season, but the problem is that no one's able to build any kind of legacy or, you know, build from one season to the next on what they've got, because they know that their top players are going to leave. Whereas PSG can retain their top players. They're actually struggling, if anything, to get rid of players that they don't want, and they're only going to strengthen. For me, what would be interesting is to see whether PSG really do change their sort of model, whether they do start now to invest more in what is actually a very successful sort of academy. It's just that none of those players go on to success at PSG because they're not given a chance in the team. So I'm hoping, you know, the talk is that they're going to have a less sort of bling bling transfer policy and maybe invest a little bit more in youth. And that might mean a season or two of transition. But if in the long run it gains PSG, firstly, more respect across the continent, and secondly, means that any success they get is by investing in talented youth, then I think that might be a good thing in the long run.
Semra, I guess the question to you is just how competitive will the upcoming season be? I'm sure Xavi will spend the summer strengthening. Despite all the financial challenges that Barcelona are in, Sevilla famously failed the test of whether they could stick to Real Madrid, and by April, it was over. Atletico could not retain a title. They were attempting to do that for the first time in 70 years. Just how competitive will the upcoming season be, given the strength of Real Madrid now?
I think it'll be just as competitive as ever. I think you've hit the nail on the head in the sense that a lot of clubs were going through a bit of a tricky situation. In the case of Barcelona, a massive rebuild for so many different reasons. Atletico Madrid had a very off season, but it was down specifically to Diego Simeone opening up at the end of the season and admitting that he overthink things. He made himself dizzy with all of the changes that he was making constantly before games, during games, with the systems, the formations, the players, and it left the players without a really clear idea as to what to do. He was going through an identity crisis for the first time in 10 years since he's been at the club as a manager. I don't think he'll be making that mistake again next season. Sevilla, they were plagued with injuries, more than almost anybody else this season for whatever reason. They also lost a lot of players to the Africa Cup of Nations, which really affected them massively as they were key players for them. So Sevilla had a very off-color season. And despite that, they were still pushing Real Madrid for most of the campaign. So I suspect that they'll improve for next season. And so I think it will be a much more competitive campaign all around. And it will be interesting to see how Real Betis cope with having European competition, the same with Real Sociedad and Villarreal. But I still think that it's going to be just as entertaining, just as exciting as ever. There's all sorts of reasons to watch La Liga and to watch all sorts of different players and managers and so on. So I would expect it to be just as competitive, if not more, than it was this season.
Semra, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Jeremy, thank you very much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, guys.
Thank you very much. You too.